today I'm going to give you some tips and tricks how to apply caulking and get the perfect bead. So we've got some new vinyl windows that were installed on this house, and we've got to caulk these windows and then repaint over the caulking. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks how to make this look absolutely amazing. One thing you want to start with a good caulking. You got to get something that's going to adhere to new vinyl windows and then adhere to your painted surface or whatever your windows are butted up against. I'm going to be using Tower Sealant's AU1 construction sealant. Absolutely amazing product, for doing something like this. It'll span the gap of actually 2 inches. So it'll span large gaps. It's going to stick to multiple different types of surfaces, and the tool's absolutely amazing. So I'm going to be using what I call a sponge caulking method. I use a painter sponge, just like this, a caulking sponge. And this is what it looks like, just like this. It's about a 6-inch sponge. It's an open cell sponge, nice and smooth. It's great for keeping your hands wet and for tooling and getting a perfect caulking bead. I'm going to be caulking with my caulking gun right here. This is an ETS 2000 caulking gun. It's a caulking gun I like. And got my Tower Sealants installed. So this is a sponge caulking method, and it's keeping your sponge wet all the time and keeping your hands wet all the time so you can tool your caulking. And what I mean by tooling it, that's what I'm using my fingers. There's a lot of tools out there that you can use to apply a caulking bead without using your hands. But your hands have nerves in them. You can feel what you're doing when you're laying out the caulking bead with some of these things called caulking fingers and these other type of things. You can't feel through what you're actually tooling the caulking bead with. So your hands are always the best option. Caulking sponge, this thing needs to be nice and wet. I do like inside, I like using lukewarm water, and it just keeps my hands warm, and it just works for cleaning the sponge a little bit faster. This sponge should be nice and wet because you want your hands to be wet at all times and clean at all times. You don't want to get any caulking built up on your hands. See, I leave a little bit of water in the sponge. You can see there's a little bit left because I want the sponge to be nice and wet and not dry. So I'm going to wring this thing out. Got my sponge. I got my 2-gallon bucket sitting on a drop cloth so I don't get anything wet on the floor. Now I'm going to begin applying my caulking. I'm going to cut my caulking tube. I typically cut it at a 45-degree angle. I don't want it flat. I like it cut at a 45-degree angle. You don't want it cut too big because you don't want to be applying too much caulking, and you don't want to cut too small because then it's not going to apply enough and fill your gap. So you just got to determine, I got a really small gap around this window. That's what I've cut off right here, and now I'm going to begin applying my caulking. When I apply my caulking, I'm going to lay my 45-degree angle out onto the surface. I want it the 45-degree angle facing into my gap or crack, and then I'm going to begin squeezing. Now, kind of the art and some of the trick about doing this is not applying too much caulking, because then you got a lot to wipe off. If you don't apply enough, it's not going to fill the whole gap, and then it's more likely to crack in the end. But one of the great things about Tower Sealants is it's less likely to crack or separate than any caulking you'll use out there. Tower AU1 sealant. This is a white caulking. It comes in a lot of different colors, but we got white vinyl windows. We've got white trim, but we're going to be repainting this trim after we're done applying it. But I'm going to start off in a corner. I'm going to apply a certain amount of caulking. You don't want to apply too much because if it starts to dry and coagulate, it's really hard to tool. Down here, it's nice and cool in this basement, so I can apply the caulking on this whole window and begin tooling it. If I was outside, I'd probably only be about half of the window and I'd begin tooling it. But I'm just going to apply a nice bead right here. I'm just going to go slow and steady. I'm going to watch the caulking coming out of my tube into the crack. I'm going to watch that it fills the crack. I'm going to go nice and slow. Keep that your angle, 45-degree angle, flat onto your crack at all times. They come back up, opposite direction. You don't want to go too fast. What people have a tendency to do is go too fast. When you go too fast, you're not filling up the entire crack. So I'm going to continue along, nice and steady, not too much, just like that. So I stop right there. Now I want to wet my hands. My hand already started to dry out. I'm gonna wet my hand, get it nice and wet, fingers nice and wet and clean. I'm gonna lightly press down on it. If I press too much, it's going to smear caulking onto the vinyl window and onto the trim way too far. So I'm gonna be and this is where your finger is so much better than any type of tool you use, because the tool cannot feel how much pressure you're putting. It can't feel the caulking at all or the sealant. So I'm just nice, light touch on it. And then when I get into my corners, I'm going to what I call tool it. I'm going to continue wetting my finger, wiping the excess off until I get that corner absolutely perfect. Just like that. And that's what it looks like. I'm going to do a little bit more. I'll continue on. All right, so I'm going to now continue from the other side. I'll give you another look at this. We got kind of a large gap in the corner right here, and then a really small gap down here. So I'm going to start off putting more caulking. I want that whole thing to be filled up, and then I'll do a little bit less as I go. So I'm going to be watching my 45-degree angles laid flat into that crack. Now I'm just cruising right along. I'm being very patient, laying my caulking bead out, getting a nice bead. I'm just watching my angle of my caulking tube, making sure that angle is flat. Go back up. I do have some cracks right here when they're installing the window. It caused this to crack down here, so I'm going to fill that in. Just a nice small bead. Now I'm coming down here. I've got a lot bigger crack, so I'm going to be cruising right along, putting a little bit more in to fill that up. So I'll show you, I'm going to tool this, and I'll show you what it looks like on that big gap right there. So I begin here, just a very light touch. I don't want to press too hard. I'm just trying to smooth out that bead. I'm trying to get it to make a nice contact with the window and a nice contact with the trim. And see, I've got a nice bead. There's barely anything on my finger as I'm smoothing it out. But I'm constantly wetting my finger. You don't want your hands to get dry at all. Coming down to these corners, it gets a little more tricky. Just wiping it off. Tool it. These corners, I'm going to just continue. Your finger's got to be really, really wet to make that nice and toolable. Just like that. Now I'm going to just continue working this until I get it just the way I want it. So this is what it's going to look like here. Now I can just take my caulking tube. I want to make sure my angle is going to be, wherever my 45-degree angle is going to lay flat on that gap. So if I got to turn my caulking tube to whatever direction, I can get that to be flat. And I'm going to turn it that direction. I'm going to begin laying out my bead. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn around and go the opposite direction so you can actually see it on this direction too from the camera. So I'm laying it out, watching it as it fills this crack, watching that I'm not putting too much. I'm watching that I'm making sure it's filling that whole gap. I'm not going too fast. I can stop, continue where I was. Right there. So that's what my bead looks like. Now I'm going to get back. I'm going to make sure my tooling finger is really wet and begin where I left off. It's good. If you press too hard, you're not going to have a super nice bead and it's going to pull too much out. If you don't press enough, it's not going to get a good bond to both edges. Once again, this caulking method, sponge caulking, you just have to be patient. It just takes time if you want it to look really, really good. So I do have a situation here where I need to get a little extra on here to fill up kind of some bumps right there. So I just added a little bit more, wet my finger. I'm gonna try to get that to smooth out a bump that was there. Now I just smooth that out, feather it out. Now build it in just a little bit more. I'll get back up here to my corner before it dries. If it starts to dry too much, it's gonna start to coagulate and your caulking won't be toolable. So I'm gonna clean my sponge and get a little bit of caulking on here because I don't want anything on my hands. Anything on my hands is going to make it so I don't get a smooth bead. What I like to say is like, with the new guys, if they start getting caulking all over the hands, it's going to get on the ends of your fingers and stuff, and what we call it is caulking boogers, and it's going to cause your finger pad to not be smooth and not give you a good caulking bead. Another tip is this has always got to be clean. Your 45-degree angle is always got to be clean. Every now and then, if you're caulking a lot, you'll start to get a little tag in on the end of your caulking tube. If you're caulking on a rough surface, if you get that little tag in, that'll kind of like mess up your bead too. So you can just trim that little tag in right off and then begin caulking again. So here we go. Start to fill in this corner. I always want a little bit more in my corners so I can make my corners nice and round. So I'm gonna start laying it out. Don't go too fast. Nice, steady speed. I'm gonna come back, tool it. Once again, I can feel the caulking. I can feel the pressure I'm putting on it. So right here, I didn't put enough pressure, so I can go back. So as I re-wet my hand, tool right back over it. I'm gonna begin working this corner now. Gonna get my finger just in the right direction. Just nice and soft, wet finger. Super wet is gonna make it look a lot better. Just try to smooth this corner out right here. Every time you touch your caulking, you want to wipe it off your finger. I'm going to put some up in this corner, fill this corner in, begin working down this direction. One thing is you have to be able to see your caulking tube, the angle. You have to be able to see the caulking coming out of your gun in order to get the correct amount of caulking on. Continue to wipe. If you make a mistake, just wipe the caulking as much out as you can with a really wet finger, and then re-caulk it and do it all over again. You have, especially indoors, you do have some working time. Outdoors, it's going to dry and coagulate a lot faster. Just like that window is sponge caulked. Looks really nice.